The backhoe's teeth bit into Kentucky soil on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, the kind of humid spring day where the air sits heavy and still over the bluegrass. The construction crew had been working the site for 3 days, clearing land for a new shopping center on the outskirts of Barron County, turning farmland that had sat fallow for years into something the developers promised would revitalize the area. The operator, a man named Dale Hutchins who'd been running heavy machinery for 2 decades, felt the resistance in his controls before he saw anything, that particular catch that tells you the bucket has found something it wasn't expecting. He lifted the arm and peered down into the fresh-turned earth, and in that moment, everything stopped. Wrapped in what looked like deteriorating fabric, stained dark with time and soil, were unmistakable human remains. Dale killed the engine, climbed down from the cab, and made the call that would crack open a case that had been buried, in every sense of the word, for 46 years. Before we continue this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Cases like this one remind us why we can't let these stories fade into silence, and your support helps keep these investigations alive in memory and in practice. Within 2 hours, the construction site had transformed into something else entirely. Yellow police tape cordoned off an area 50 feet in each direction from where the backhoe sat silent, its bucket still raised as if frozen in the act of discovery. Forensic investigators from the Kentucky State Police moved carefully through the dirt, photographing, measuring, documenting every detail before they touched anything. The county coroner arrived in a black SUV, followed shortly by agents from the FBI's evidence response team, because everyone who'd been working law enforcement in Barron County long enough had an immediate suspicion about whose remains these might be. The local news vans came next, parking along the county road, their satellite dishes extending toward a cloudless sky. By late afternoon, the whispers had already started in town, spreading through the grocery store, the post office, the pews of First Baptist Church. Old-timers who'd lived through 1978 felt something cold settle in their stomachs, a knowing, a terrible recognition. The younger residents, those who'd moved to the area in the decades since, were about to learn about the ghost that had haunted their community for nearly half a century. Her name was Rebecca Lynn Holloway, though everyone who knew her called her Becky, and in the summer of 1978 she was 19 years old and home from the University of Kentucky for summer break. She had honey blonde hair that she wore long and straight the way girls did then, parted down the middle, and a smile that people remembered decades later as genuinely warm, the kind that reached her eyes and made you feel like you mattered. She was studying elementary education, determined to become a teacher, and her professors had already noted in her file that she had a natural gift with children, a patience and creativity that couldn't be taught. She was the middle child in a family of 5, sandwiched between an older brother who worked at the Ford plant in Louisville and a younger sister still in high school. Her father, Thomas Holloway, managed the farm supply store on Main Street. Her mother, Dorothy, worked part-time at the county library and spent her evenings tending a garden that produced tomatoes so perfect the neighbors talked about them at town gatherings. Becky had grown up in Cave City, a small community in Barron County where the population hovered around 2,000 souls, the kind of place where Friday night football games drew the whole town, and everybody knew not just your name, but your grandparents' names, and probably what your family brought to the church potluck. It was a place built on limestone and tourism, close enough to Mammoth Cave National Park that the economy rose and fell with the seasonal visitors who came to see the world's longest-known cave system. The town had a main street with diagonal parking, a courthouse with a Confederate monument that nobody questioned back then, 2 traffic lights, and more churches than bars. It was safe, or everyone believed it was safe, the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors and children rode their bicycles until the streetlights came on. That summer of 1978, Becky had taken a job at Rosie's Diner, a chrome and vinyl establishment on the edge of town that served breakfast all day and attracted both locals and tourists heading to or from the cave. She worked the evening shift, 4 to 11, serving meatloaf and pie and endless cups of coffee to truck drivers, families on vacation, and regulars who came in at the same time every day and ordered the same thing. She was saving money for her senior year, but more than that, she seemed to genuinely enjoy the work. Her co-workers remembered her as someone who never complained about difficult customers, who remembered people's usual orders, who had a knack for making conversation feel easy and natural. She talked about her boyfriend, Michael Crane, who worked at his father's auto repair shop and had given her a promise ring at Christmas. They were planning a wedding for the following June after she graduated. She'd already picked out bridesmaids' dresses from a catalog pale yellow because she thought they'd photograph well. Her best friend since elementary school, a girl named Patricia Simmons, was going to be her maid of honor. The regulars at Rosie's Diner developed their favorites among the waitresses, and Becky had her share of admirers, men who requested to sit in her section, who left generous tips, who lingered over coffee longer than necessary. Most were harmless, the usual cast of characters in a small-town restaurant. There was old Mr. Patterson, who came in every evening at 6 for the early bird special. There was a traveling salesman who passed through twice a month and always ordered the chicken fried steak. There was a man in his 30s, someone who'd moved to the area recently to work at a local business, who came in several times a week and always sat at the counter, always when Becky was working. Years later, people would try to remember his name, to recall details about him, but memory is a strange thing, unreliable, shaped by hindsight and suggestion. In the moment, he was just another customer, polite enough, quiet, someone who blended into the background of daily life. Becky's routine that summer was predictable in the way young people's routines often are. She'd drive to work in the late afternoon in her mother's Ford Pinto, the blue one with the dent in the passenger door from where her brother had backed into a fence post. She'd tie on her apron, tuck her hair back, and work the dinner rush until closing. Most nights, Michael would pick her up when her shift ended, and they'd drive around for a while, maybe stop at the Dairy Queen, talking about their future the way young couples do, where they'd live, how many children they wanted, whether they'd stay in Cave City or move to a bigger town. But Michael worked early mornings at the garage, and sometimes he had to be up before dawn, so there were nights when Becky walked home instead. It was less than a mile from the diner to her parents' house on Sycamore Street, a straight shot down a road that passed between fields and a few scattered houses. In the summer of 1978, in a town like Cave City, walking home alone at 11 at night didn't seem dangerous. It was just what you did. Her mother would sometimes wait up for her, sitting in the living room with a book or some mending, listening for the sound of the front door. Her father usually went to bed early, exhausted from days at the store, but he was a light sleeper, and he'd call out good night when he heard her come in. Her younger sister Annie shared a bedroom with Becky, and on the nights when Becky worked late, Annie would stay awake reading by flashlight, waiting to hear about the drama of the dinner shift, the demanding customers, the terrible tippers, the couple who had an argument over dessert. These were the small rhythms of their lives, unremarkable and precious in ways nobody recognized until they were gone. What nobody knew that summer, what nobody could have known, was that someone was watching. Someone was paying attention to Becky's schedule, to the nights Michael didn't pick her up, to the route she took walking home through the dark. Someone was building towards something, planning something, waiting for the right moment. In small towns, we like to believe we know everyone, that familiarity equals safety. But the people we see at the grocery store and the gas station and the church potluck couldn't possibly harbor darkness. We trust our neighbors because we've known them for years, because they coach Little League or serve on the town council or bring casseroles when someone dies. We forget that monsters don't always look like strangers. Sometimes they look like us. Sometimes they sit across from us at the diner counter, ordering coffee and pie, smiling that same unremarkable smile, hiding in plain sight while they wait for their opportunity. Becky's parents remember her being happy that summer, talking excitedly about her fall semester classes, about the wedding plans, about a future that seemed bright and certain. She'd recently been accepted into a competitive student teaching program. She'd found a pattern for her wedding dress in a bridal magazine and spent evenings sketching modifications she wanted to make. She was reading a novel called The Stand by some new author named Stephen King, and she kept telling her mother it was the scariest thing she'd ever read, but she couldn't put it down. These are the details that families hold on to later, the small, ordinary moments that become sacred when they're all that's left. The way she liked her coffee with too much sugar. The worn pair of sneakers she refused to throw away. The sound of her laugh coming from her bedroom when she was on the phone with Patricia. The mundane textures of a life that seemed like it would go on forever. Where are you watching from today? Take a moment to think about the small towns you've known, the places where everyone believes they're safe because they recognize every face. Cave City in 1978 was like thousands of other American towns, insulated by familiarity, protected by the illusion that tragedy only happens somewhere else, to someone else. But tragedy doesn't respect town boundaries or population size. Evil doesn't require a big city to hide in. Sometimes it just requires patience and the mask of normalcy. And on June 17, 1978, that mask was about to slip. June 17, 1978 was a Saturday, and the evening shift at Rosie's Diner was busier than usual, with families stopping in after spending the day at Mammoth Cave. The air conditioning struggled against the heat that had built up throughout the day, and the oscillating fan behind the counter did little more than push warm air from one side of the restaurant to the other. Becky had been on her feet since 4 in the afternoon, refilling coffee cups and carrying plates of fried chicken and mashed potatoes to booths filled with sunburned tourists and locals escaping their own kitchens. Her co-worker that night, a woman named Janet Mills, who was 10 years older and had been waitressing at Rosie's since it opened, would later tell investigators that Becky seemed normal that evening, maybe a little tired from the rush, but in good spirits, humming along to the radio when things slowed down. Around 9:30, Becky mentioned that Michael wasn't picking her up because he had to be at the garage before sunrise the next morning for an emergency repair job, something about a farmer's tractor that had broken down during planting season. She'd walk home like she sometimes did. It wasn't a big deal. Janet didn't think anything of it. The diner closed at 11, and the cleanup routine was always the same. Wipe down the counter and tables, refill the sugar dispensers and salt shakers, sweep the floor, count out the register, lock the front door. The owner, a man named Frank Rosenberg, who everyone called Rosie despite him being a 6'2" former Marine, had already left for the night. The cook, a teenage boy saving up for a car, finished cleaning the kitchen around 11:15 and headed out through the back door to where his older brother was waiting to give him a ride. Janet had her own car parked out front, and she asked Becky if she wanted a lift home. Becky declined, said it was a nice night, and she didn't mind the walk, said the fresh air would feel good after being inside all evening. Janet understood that. Sometimes, after a long shift in the diner's recycled air and grease smell, you wanted to breathe something clean. Janet locked up, got in her car, waved to Becky, who was standing under the diner's neon sign, and drove off toward her own house on the other side of town. That was the last time anyone who cared about Becky Holloway saw her alive. The route from Rosie's Diner to the Holloway house on Sycamore Street followed County Road 218, a 2-lane strip of asphalt that curved gently through an area that was half residential, half farmland. Street lights were sparse, just a few scattered poles that created small islands of yellow light in the darkness. During the day, you'd pass the Henderson farm with its white fence and grazing horses, the abandoned gas station that had closed 2 years earlier, a couple of modest ranch houses set back from the road, and then a stretch of empty field before the houses became more frequent as you approached the residential part of Cave City. At night, most of these landmarks disappeared into shadow. The houses that were occupied showed lights in their windows, but people were usually inside, watching television or getting ready for bed, not looking out at the road. It was quiet out there after dark, just crickets and the occasional car passing through, headlights sweeping across the pavement before disappearing around a curve. Nobody knows exactly what happened on that walk. The facts are limited to absence and discovery. Becky left the diner sometime between 11:15 and 11:20. The walk should have taken 15 minutes, maybe 20 if she was going slow. By midnight, Dorothy Holloway was concerned, but not yet panicked. By 12:30, she woke her husband, and Thomas drove the route to the diner and back, looking for his daughter, seeing nothing. By 1 in the morning, they called the police. By sunrise, half the town was searching. The sheriff in 1978 was a man named Warren Dockery, who'd held the position for 12 years and had never worked a homicide, never even worked a missing person case that didn't resolve itself within a few hours with a sheepish teenager returning home after losing track of time. He organized search parties methodically, dividing the town into grids, sending volunteers to walk the fields and check the ditches along every road. Michael Crane was out there before dawn, wild-eyed and desperate, calling Becky's name until his voice went hoarse. Patricia Simmons walked with Becky's mother, both of them clutching flashlights, looking for any sign, any clue. They found nothing. No purse, no shoe, no piece of clothing. It was as if Becky had simply evaporated between the diner and her home, stepped out of the world without leaving a trace. The investigation that followed was thorough by the standards of a small-town sheriff's department in 1978, but limited by the technology and resources of the era. Sheriff Dockery interviewed everyone who'd been at the diner that night, everyone who lived along County Road 218, everyone who knew Becky or might have seen her. Michael Crane was questioned extensively, his alibi checked and rechecked. He'd been home with his parents, in bed by 10:30. His father confirmed it. His grief seemed genuine, devastating. He aged 10 years in the first week after Becky disappeared. Janet Mills was interviewed multiple times, walking detectives through every detail of that final shift, trying to remember if anyone had been watching Becky, if any customer had seemed off or too interested. She couldn't say for certain. The diner had been busy. There were always people watching the waitresses. That was just part of working in a restaurant. Detectives looked at the traveling salesman who'd been a regular, tracked him down in Tennessee where he was visiting family, confirmed his alibis. They looked at Mr. Sinker, Patterson the elderly regular, but he had dementia and could barely remember his own name, let alone plan an abduction. They compiled a list of every man who'd been seen at the diner in the weeks before. Becky vanished, but memories were vague, details uncertain. One witness mentioned a man who drove a dark-colored sedan and sat at the counter, someone who might have been new to the area, but the description was too generic to be useful. Dark hair or maybe light brown, average height, 30 or 40 years old. It could have been a dozen different people. Without physical evidence, without witnesses to the actual abduction, the investigation spun in circles, generating reports and interviews that led nowhere. The theories multiplied in the absence of facts. Some people believed Becky had run away, though everyone who knew her said that was impossible. She was happy, she was planning a wedding, she loved her family. Some thought she'd been picked up by a stranger passing through town, maybe a truck driver or a drifter, someone random and untraceable. Others suspected it had to be someone local, someone who knew her routine, who'd been watching and waiting. The boyfriend always draws suspicion in cases like this. And despite his alibi, despite the visible devastation that seemed to be consuming him, some people whispered. The police investigated him thoroughly, found nothing. His grief was real. His alibi was solid. He wasn't involved. Weeks became months. The search parties stopped going out. The news coverage faded. The missing person posters that had been stapled to every telephone pole in town began to weather and peel. Becky's smiling face bleached by the sun until it was barely recognizable. The case went cold, not because the police gave up, but because there was nowhere left to look, no new leads to follow, no evidence to analyze. In 1978, DNA profiling didn't exist. Security cameras were rare. Cell phone records weren't a thing, because cell phones weren't a thing. A person could vanish, and without witnesses or physical evidence, they might stay vanished forever. Dorothy Holloway never stopped looking. Every year on June 17th, she would place an advertisement in the local newspaper, Becky's photograph above a plea for information, a promise of reward money the family had scraped together. She kept Becky's bedroom exactly as it had been, the Stephen King novel still on the nightstand with a bookmark holding her place, the sketches of the wedding dress still pinned to the bulletin board. She attended every vigil organized by families of missing persons, held candles in courthouse squares across Kentucky, became a quiet advocate for the lost. Thomas retreated into himself, became quieter, older, haunted. Their son moved away, couldn't bear to stay in the town where his sister had disappeared. Their younger daughter, Annie, grew up in the shadow of her missing sister, carrying survivor's guilt and the weight of her parents' grief. Michael Crane never married. He dated occasionally over the years, but nothing serious, nothing that lasted. People who knew him said he couldn't let go, that some part of him was still that 20-year-old kid waiting for his girlfriend to come home. He kept the promise ring he'd given Becky in a box in his bedroom, took it out sometimes and turned it over in his fingers, remembering. Patricia Simmons became a social worker specializing in victim services, dedicating her career to helping people navigate the aftermath of violent crime and loss. She said in an interview decades later that losing Becky had shown her how the system failed people, how families were left adrift without support or answers, and she'd spent her life trying to be for others what no one had been for Becky's family. The case haunted the Cave City Police Department as well. Sheriff Dockery retired in 1985, and at his retirement party he gave a short speech where he mentioned only one regret in his career, one failure he couldn't shake. He didn't have to say the name. Everyone knew. The detective who'd been assigned as lead investigator, a young officer named Raymond Porter, kept the case file in his office even after he made sergeant, even after he made lieutenant, even after he retired in 2003. He'd pull it out periodically, read through the witness statements and reports, hoping to see something he'd missed, some connection he hadn't made. The file grew thicker over the years as he added notes from periodic reviews, updates when similar cases occurred in other jurisdictions, reminders to himself about leads he wanted to recheck if he ever had time. After he retired, he took a copy of the file home with him. His wife said he'd sit at the kitchen table late at night sometimes, reading through those pages, talking to himself about what might have happened on County Road 218 that June night in 1978. The town itself changed slowly, the way all small towns do. The population grew as people from Louisville and Nashville discovered the area's lower cost of living. New subdivisions were built on what used to be farmland. The old downtown struggled as a Walmart opened on the highway. Rosie's Diner closed in 1992. The building eventually demolished to make way for a chain pharmacy. The people who remembered Becky got older, and the new residents had never heard her name. But in certain circles, among certain families, the memory persisted. Dorothy Holloway's annual newspaper advertisements ran until 2015, when she died at age 83, her daughter's fate still unknown. Her obituary mentioned that she was preceded in death by her husband Thomas and her daughter Rebecca Lynn. It didn't say missing, it said deceased, because after 37 years, even hope has to acknowledge reality. Cases like Becky's weren't unique. Before DNA, before national databases, before the forensic revolution of the 21st century, thousands of people vanished into silence. Their families grieved without closure. Their killers walked free, protected by the simple fact that without evidence, without witnesses, without the technology to connect crime to criminal, justice was often impossible. The files sat in boxes in evidence rooms, marked cold, waiting for something that might never come. And then technology changed everything. In the spring of 2023, the Kentucky State Police established a new cold case unit with dedicated funding and a specific mandate to review unsolved homicides and missing person cases using modern forensic technology. The unit consisted of 3 investigators, a forensic genealogist, and access to state-of-the-art DNA analysis equipment that would have seemed like science fiction to the detectives who'd worked these cases decades earlier. The technology that changed everything was called forensic genealogy, a method that combined DNA analysis with genetic databases and traditional genealogical research to identify suspects through their family relationships. It was the same science that had caught the Golden State Killer in California in 2018, that had solved dozens of cold cases across the country in the years since. And now it was coming to Kentucky. Detective Sarah Chen, a former homicide investigator from Louisville who joined the cold case unit specifically because she believed in the power of this new science, pulled the Rebecca Holloway file in June of 2023, exactly 45 years after Becky had disappeared. The timing was coincidental, but it felt significant somehow, like the universe acknowledging an anniversary. The file was thick, documented in the careful handwriting and typed reports of multiple generations of investigators. But what interested Chen most was the evidence log. In 1978, Sheriff Dockery's department had collected what physical evidence they could find, even without a crime scene, even without a body. They'd taken fingernail scrapings from Becky's hairbrush at her parents' house, save for possible future comparison. They'd collected cigarette butts from the area around the diner, though Becky didn't smoke. They'd preserved fibers found on the break room chair where Becky had sat during her dinner break that final shift. It wasn't much, and none of it had been particularly useful at the time, but they'd saved it anyway, stored it in paper bags and manila envelopes in the evidence room, just in case someday it might matter. What Chen didn't have was a crime scene or a body, which meant she didn't have the perpetrator's DNA in any direct form. But she had something else, something that hadn't existed in 1978. She had the construction site where Dale Hutchins had unearthed those remains 3 months earlier. The forensic analysis had confirmed what everyone in Cave City already suspected. The bones belonged to Rebecca Lynn Holloway, identified through dental records and what degraded DNA could be extracted and compared to samples from her younger sister Annie, now a 57-year-old woman living in Nashville. The fabric wrapped around the remains had been analyzed, determined to be a type of canvas tarp common in the late 70s, available at any farm supply store. And critically, in the soil immediately surrounding the remains, forensic technicians had found trace evidence that had been preserved by the particular chemistry of Kentucky limestone and clay. The science of what happens to DNA in soil is complex, affected by pH levels and moisture and temperature, and a dozen other variables, but sometimes, under the right conditions, genetic material can survive for decades. The forensic team had found epithelial cells, the kind shed from skin, mixed in the soil layer directly above where the body had been placed. The theory was that whoever had buried Becky had sweated while digging, had touched the tarp while wrapping her, had left microscopic traces of himself in the grave without knowing it. In 1978, those cells would have been invisible and useless. In 2023, they were a roadmap. The DNA extraction process took weeks, working with degraded samples that were more gaps than information, using techniques that could amplify tiny fragments of genetic code into something readable. The profile they eventually constructed wasn't complete, not the full sequence you get from a fresh blood sample, but it was enough to tell them the perpetrator was male, enough to identify certain genetic markers, enough to upload into the genealogical databases and start building family trees. The forensic genealogist assigned to the case was a woman named Linda Marsh, who'd worked similar cases for the FBI and had a reputation for being able to untangle the most complicated family relationships. She uploaded the partial DNA profile to GED Match, one of the public databases that allowed law enforcement searches, and waited for the system to identify matches. What came back were distant relatives, third cousins and fourth cousins, people who shared a great-great-grandparent with the unknown suspect but had probably never met him, didn't know he existed. This was expected. This was how the process worked. Marsh took those distant matches and began the painstaking process of building family trees backward and forward through time, using census records and birth certificates, and marriage licenses and obituaries, constructing elaborate genealogical charts that branched and intersected across generations. It took 6 months. 6 months of research, of eliminating branches, of tracking down descendants and comparing ages and locations. The suspect would have been an adult in 1978, probably between 20 and 50 years old, which meant he'd been born between 1928 and 1958. He would have been in or near Cave City in June of 1978. Marsh narrowed the possibilities through a combination of science and detective work, eliminating men who died before 1978, men who'd been living in other states, men who were too young or too old. The family trees began to converge, different branches pointing toward a common ancestor, and then forward again through the generations to a smaller and smaller pool of possibilities. By December 2023, they had it down to 3 men. All 3 were the right age. All 3 had connections to Barron County in 1978. All 3 were still alive. Detective Chen started the process of elimination, checking alibis that were 45 years old, interviewing people whose memories of that distant summer were fragmentary at best, building circumstantial cases around each possibility. One of the 3 had been in the military in 1978, stationed in Germany during June of that year. Eliminated. Another had been in prison in Ohio for armed robbery during the summer of 1978, his incarceration thoroughly documented. Eliminated. That left 1 name, 1 man, and when Chen saw it, something cold settled in her stomach. His name was Dennis Wayne Keller, and in 1978 he'd been 32 years old, married, the father of 2 young children. He'd moved to Cave City in 1977 to manage a John Deere dealership on the edge of town. One of those men who showed up with credentials and a firm handshake and a friendly demeanor that made people trust him. He'd been good at his job, active in the community, coached youth basketball at the rec center. After 1978, he continued living in Cave City, moved up to own the dealership, became a respected businessman. He served on the town council in the 90s. He was a deacon at Cave City Methodist Church. He'd been married to the same woman for 47 years. His children had grown up and given him grandchildren. He was 77 years old now, retired, living in a well-maintained ranch house on the north side of town, the kind of man people nodded to at the grocery store, the kind of grandfather who handed out candy at Halloween. Chen pulled everything she could find on Dennis Keller. His financial records, his employment history, his phone records going back as far as they existed digitally. She interviewed people who'd known him in 1978, asking casual questions about where he lived then, what he drove, where he spent his time. The picture that emerged was troubling in its ordinariness. In June of 1978, Keller had lived in a small rental house on County Road 288, less than half a mile from Rosie's Diner, between the diner and the Holloway house. He drove a dark blue Ford sedan. Multiple people remembered him eating at the diner regularly, said he liked to sit at the counter, said he was friendly enough but quiet, kept to himself mostly. One former co-worker from the dealership mentioned, almost as an aside, that Keller had seemed distracted that summer, had missed a few days of work in late June, said something about having the flu. Chen brought the case to the district attorney. The DNA evidence was solid enough to indicate that Dennis Keller was almost certainly the source of the epithelial cells found in Becky Holloway's grave. The genealogical analysis showed a probability of something like 99.7% that the DNA belonged to someone in his immediate family line, and he was the only member of that family line who fit the geographic and temporal parameters. But the DA had concerns. The DNA was degraded, the sample small. A good defense attorney would challenge the testing methods, the chain of custody, the interpretation of results. They needed more. They needed something that would eliminate any reasonable doubt. Chen went back to Keller's history, digging deeper. She found something that made her hands shake when she read it. In 1982, 4 years after Becky Holloway disappeared, a woman in a town 60 miles from Cave City had reported being attacked by a man who'd offered her a ride when her car broke down on a rural highway. The woman had managed to escape, fighting her attacker and running into the woods until she found a house where someone called the police. She'd given a description, but the man was never caught. The case file was thin, the investigation minimal by modern standards. Chen tracked down the victim, now in her 70s, and showed her a photo array that included Dennis Keller's driver's license photo from 1982. The woman's hand went to her mouth. She wasn't certain, couldn't be certain after more than 40 years, but something about the eyes, she said. Something about the shape of his face. It could be him. It wasn't enough for charges in that case. The statute of limitations had long passed anyway, but it established a pattern. Chen found 2 more cases. Unsolved attacks on women in central Kentucky during the 80s, both involving men who'd offered rides, both victims managing to escape. None of the victims could make a positive identification from old photographs, but the pattern was there, documented, suggesting that Dennis Keller might have spent decades doing this, that Becky Holloway might not have been his only victim, just the only one who didn't get away. The decision to arrest came in March of 2024. The DA felt they had enough, that a jury would see the DNA evidence combined with the circumstantial details and reach the right conclusion. On a Thursday morning, Detective Chen and 4 other officers drove to Dennis Keller's house on Elm Street, where he was working in his garden, planting tomatoes in the early spring sunshine. He looked up when he saw the police cars, and Chen said later that something flickered across his face, something that looked almost like relief, like a man who'd been waiting for this moment for 46 years and was almost glad it had finally arrived. They read him his rights there in his garden, dirt still on his knees, his wife watching from the doorway in shock and confusion. Keller said nothing, didn't ask what this was about, didn't protest his innocence, just stood up slowly and held out his hands for the handcuffs. The silence felt like an admission. The news spread through Cave City faster than it had when the remains were discovered, faster than anything anyone could remember. Dennis Keller, arrested for the murder of Rebecca Holloway. The disbelief was palpable, visceral. People who'd known him for decades, who'd bought tractors from him, who'd sat next to him in church, who'd trusted him with their children, couldn't reconcile the man they knew with the monster being described. His wife claimed innocence, said there must be a mistake, said Dennis was a good man, a godly man. His children hired an expensive attorney out of Louisville. But the evidence was there, and it was solid, and slowly, reluctantly, the community began to accept the impossible truth that a killer had been living among them for nearly 50 years, attending town meetings and church socials, coaching basketball and serving Thanksgiving dinner to his family, hiding behind a mask of normalcy that had never slipped until DNA technology finally saw through it. The preliminary hearing happened in May. Keller pleaded not guilty, but the evidence was presented. The DNA analysis explained by expert witnesses who walked the judge through the science of forensic genealogy. The statistical probability that the DNA found in Becky's grave belonged to Dennis Keller. The judge found probable cause. The trial was scheduled for September. But something happened in July. Keller's attorney requested a meeting with the DA, And in that meeting, Keller agreed to plead guilty in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole, avoiding a trial that would have dragged his family through months of testimony and evidence. The DA agreed, knowing that a trial was never a guarantee, knowing that this way, at least, there would be closure. On August 15, 2024, Dennis Wayne Keller stood in a Barron County courtroom and admitted that he had abducted Rebecca Holloway on June 17, 1978, that he had killed her and buried her body in a field that he had access to through his work at the dealership. He didn't provide details, didn't explain why, didn't show remorse in any way that seemed genuine. He read a prepared statement that his attorney had clearly written, words about being sorry for the pain caused, words that rang hollow in the quiet courtroom. Annie Holloway, Becky's younger sister, was there. Michael Crane was there, 70 years old now, and looking every day of it. Patricia Simmons was there. Raymond Porter, the retired detective who'd carried this case for decades, was there, tears streaming down his weathered face. The judge sentenced Keller to life without parole, and as the bailiffs led him away, Annie stood and said something that the courtroom heard clearly in the silence. She said, "My mother waited her whole life to know what happened. She died without answers. But at least now we know. At least now Becky can rest." It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't peace exactly, but it was something. It was an ending, however incomplete, however late. The truth is that justice delayed by 46 years doesn't feel like justice in the way we want it to. Becky never got to become a teacher, never got to wear that yellow dress with modifications wedding gown, never got to live the life that should have been hers. Her parents died without knowing what happened to their daughter. Michael Crane lost half a century to grief and unanswered questions. And Dennis Keller lived a full life, raised children, knew his grandchildren, enjoyed freedoms and joys that he'd stolen from Becky when he was 32 years old, and decided that his desires mattered more than her life. There's no making that right, no sentence that balances that equation. But there's value in truth, in finally knowing, in pulling monsters out of the shadows even decades later. The technology that caught Dennis Keller is catching others, solving cases that investigators thought would never be solved, bringing answers to families who'd given up hope. Every DNA profile uploaded to a database is another chance for justice, another possibility that someone who thought they'd gotten away with murder might finally face consequences. It's not perfect, not fast, not always satisfying, but it's something. It's progress. In Cave City, they held a memorial service for Becky in September, finally able to lay her to rest properly after all these years. The church was full, a mixture of people who remembered her, and people who'd only learned her story through the news coverage of the arrest and trial. They sang hymns and shared memories and acknowledged the particular tragedy of a life cut short at 19, full of potential that would never be realized. Annie spoke about her sister, about the bedroom they shared, about the sound of Becky's laughter, about the weight of growing up as the sister who survived. She ended by saying that maybe some good could come from this horror if it reminded people to pay attention to the cold cases, to the missing, to the families still waiting for answers. The construction site where Becky's remains were found was blessed by a local minister and left undisturbed. The shopping center plans modified to root around that particular plot of ground. Someone planted a dogwood tree there, Becky's favorite, and placed a small memorial stone that read simply, Rebecca Lynn Holloway, 1959-1978, Forever 19, Finally Home. Time doesn't heal all wounds, but sometimes it delivers truth, and truth, however painful, is better than silence. In the 46 years between Becky's murder and Dennis Keller's arrest, the world changed in ways that 1978 couldn't have imagined. And among those changes was the simple fact that DNA evidence can survive in soil, that genetic genealogy can build bridges across generations that science can reach, backward through decades and name the guilty. Becky Holloway's case is closed now, marked solved, filed away with an ending instead of a question mark. It's not the ending anyone wanted, but it's an ending nonetheless. And for her family, for the investigators who never stopped trying, for a community that carried this grief for half a century, that has to be enough.